But a coup has actually already happened on American soil. Pop up that tweet, Dwayne. Can we get a tweet from the Equal Justice Initiative? So this week marked the anniversary. I think it was November 10th. 1898 is when the Wilmington coup occurred in Wilmington, North Carolina, where a gang of angry whites um, took over the city government. A biracial government was elected into office in Wilmington. Mobs of armed white supremacists invaded Wilmington City Hall in North Carolina and forced everyone to resign. The mob also destroyed Black businesses and killed dozens of Black people. And I'm sure that you were not taught about this in school. That is not surprising. A lot of people weren't taught the Tulsa uprisings either, and a number of other instances in the United States where racial hatred was a motivator. Black and Indigenous people and Latinx people murdered and killed by white supremacy. So today, to kind of give us some historical context about what the Wilmington coup was all about back in 1898. Today we are joined with Christopher Everett. Chris is the director of a documentary called Wilmington On Fire. About the instances that happened in Wilmington. He is based in Durham. He's also producer and director of the award-winning documentary, again, Wilmington On Fire. He is the founder and president of Speller Street Films in North Carolina. And today we're also joined with Blake Hill Saya. Blake is the author of Erin McDuffie Moore, an African-American physician, educator, and founder of Durham's Black Wall Street, which is a biography about her great-great-grandfather, and it's being published on the UNC Press. She's also a writer and storytelling coach based in Los Angeles. We are so grateful to have you both join us today and give us a history lesson, something that is very much needed in these times for historical context. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear us okay?
Okay, wonderful. Okay, excellent. So Chris, can we get started with you and talk to us about what happened this same week of November in 1898? But I guess tell us what happened beforehand. How did we even get a biracial city government elected in Wilmington, North Carolina in the late 1800s? That sounds awfully progressive for the times and for the location.
Yes, it is. Wilmington in the 1890s, it was the main city in North Carolina back then. A lot of people who are familiar with the state of North Carolina, Charlotte, Raleigh are like the big cities. But back in the 1890s, Wilmington was that place to be. It was North Carolina's largest city at the time. And it was very welcoming to African Americans during this time as well. And how African Americans got in political power throughout North Carolina, several places in North Carolina, but specifically to Wilmington, was because of this thing called fusion politics, where you had Black folks who were Republican at the time merged and joined forces with, white folks that kind of were dissatisfied with what the Democratic Party were doing at the time, and they just merged together to kind of put their people in office. They figured out that, hey, even though you're Black, I'm white, we have similar interests. We all want good schools for our kids. We all want to start businesses, and we want to get involved in politics. So they created this thing called fusion. And with this fusion movement, they were able to put their people in office, especially in Wilmington. And so there was also a white supremacist movement that was already there that really stemmed from the Civil War. And those folks really didn't like that, and they really wanted to change that to bring Wilmington and the state of North Carolina back to that era before the Civil War. And that's when the massacre happened, and then the actual overthrow of the government in Wilmington.
Blake, talk to us about what was present in the Black part of Durham at the time that the coup actually took place, and what was taken away after the mob was done their murderous rampage. I mean, that's not hyperbole. That's exactly what happened.
Well, just to be clear, this happened in the murders happened in Wilmington. Durham did not experience. Durham did not experience this kind of violence. But the story in Durham is quite interesting as well. So to set the stage, I think has already been set very well. What the aftermath of it was certainly the beginning of the end of Black participation in politics in the South for another 90 years. I think it's important to acknowledge that there were Black sheriffs, Black police officers, Black judges, Black lawyers, Black business owners. The entire city government was a radical Republican government. It's really important, before we even really go much into the politics here, to absolutely make the point that the radical Republican Party of this time was the party of Lincoln, was the party of emancipation, was the party of abolitionists, Northern ideas, what the Southern planter class called scalawags and carpetbaggers, and also Black folks who voted to have participation and to have their rights upheld by the post-Civil War Reconstructionist ideals. So radical Republicans were what we might call, even today, the Progressive Party. And the Democratic Party was the party of the Southern Democratic white planter class, who wanted to uphold the old mores of the South, who wanted the races divided and Black people subjugated, who were white supremacists, plain and simple. And in the lead up to this 1898 coup, which it absolutely was the only successful political coup in American history, they widely publicized nationwide, including all the way up to the White House, their intentions to have this coup, their white supremacist agenda. The North Carolina Democratic Party Convention Handbook, in fact, even called it a white supremacist agenda that they had. Their number one tool was to sow discord between those who had made fusionist politics happen through the two elections prior to 1898, which had put that party very much in power. They were bent on sowing racial discord in order to do that, in order to get particularly the white Southern poorer farmer and working class folks to pull away from their allyship with Black leaders who were frankly more focused on them getting better services and better education for their kids, et cetera, than the Democrats were, the Southern Democrats. So their number one handbook goal was to sow racial discord. And they did that in the papers. They did it through political cartoons for those folks who were not literate. Many of the poorer white classes were not literate. So they came up with some pretty hideous cartoons all about Negro rule. Lots of big, burly looking Black folks in spats for some reason. That was a big deal. Stepping on the necks of white people and, picturing them as animals and just these predatory creatures that were trying to take over not only the government, but the safety and virtue of white women's bodies. And this was an agenda that was, repeated over and over again from the spring all the way through November of 1898 to foment this kind of feeling. And it worked. It absolutely worked. It was a news campaign. It was a on-the-ground campaign. There were picnics and parades and all kinds of activities for the family in Wilmington, for white families to get together and talk about how white supremacy was the future. It's really very chilling to go through this kind of research and read that this happened on American soil, but it most certainly did. And it was very much framed as actual, American patriotism was framed as the purview of white supremacy, and that to be white was to be American, and everyone else was excluded from that picture of what being truly American and patriotic was. And we see, lots of echoes of this in current politics. In fact, there was a force out in the streets leading up to the election, actively threatening and fomenting fear in the Black community, called the Red Shirts. Anybody see red hats in that? And they would go house to house and threaten people, often beat the Black members of the family who were able to vote, because remember, at this time, only Black males were able to vote. So any Black male they ran into, they beat or intimidated or threatened. The white community actually even raised money to purchase a machine gun, which was state of the art, right out of the Spanish-American War. And they would demonstrate it to Black leaders in order to let them know that they had also military might on their side. It is little known that. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, not to cut you off, Blake. I mean, that sounds extremely familiar. Please. Very some similar tactics. I wanted to ask Chris another question because, I'm curious about. I think Blake was touching on this, but the role of law enforcement in this coup. How were they used to enact what the white supremacist mob was there to get in terms of the biracially elected? Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying that back then, right before the massacre, you actually had Black police officers in the city of Wilmington during this time. I know one brother that we talked to, he didn't end up in the film, but his great-great-grandfather, in the film, you see a picture of his great-great-grandfather. I think his name was David Bryant. He was a police officer prior to the massacre of 1898. And what they did was they pretty much removed a lot of these fusion folks who were aligned with the fusion movement and Republican movement, off the police force as well. So they were able to really do what they wanted to do because they stripped a lot of these brothers, from their positions to do anything. And also during this time, which was really very interesting, that when I did my research and other folks did their research, this was around the time of, the Spanish-American War as well. And a lot of the Black soldiers, were away, during this time. So it's mighty funny that they decided to do this coup when folks that could have protected the community weren't there, at all. So, it was a very strategic thing, all the way around to really pull off this coup. For years, folks thought it was just like a spontaneous, insurrection type of thing. But, this is a very calculated coup, from top to bottom.
That also sounds familiar. A lot of echoes of 2020, sort of, I hope not being like a precursor to perhaps what we could expect for this outcome of this election. Taure, I know this is your neck of the woods, not Wilmington, but North Carolina. Do you have any questions for Chris or Blake?
Yeah, Chris, I definitely remember. I mean, I saw the film first in full frame. So shout out to Durham. At that time, definitely. What I thought about was just also the class dynamics that went on at the time. When I remember watching the film, that the folks who were leading the coup, I mean, these weren't just like poor white folks who were, upset and pissed off and had economic anxiety who decided to overthrow the government, right? I feel like these were, high class white folks, the families that were in the town, some families that even maybe still exist in Wilmington today. And then also when we think about the victims, right, I remember there being a class divide among Black folks. So the richer Black folks were able to get on trains and other things like that and, go move to their families, not to say that they weren't impacted, but the poor Black folks, basically had to head to the swamps. So basically what I'm asking you, just maybe talk a little bit about those kind of class dynamics and how they played into everything that happened.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I'll start, with the Black community in Wilmington. You had, quite a few well-off African-Americans in the city of Wilmington. And then you also had, I guess your standard working class Black person because, the ports were really big in Wilmington during that time. So like I said, a lot of people came to that town, especially African Americans, because you can kind of get in there and get a job at the ports, and really work your way up and just provide for your family, So some of those folks that worked at the ports or did some jobs like that, they were affected, especially when the coup happened. A lot of them maybe were renters at the time. And so they just packed up and just left, because they were renting. They just said, forget this, I'm out of here, and just moved to, some folks moved to Durham as well. Or some people just left the whole state, in general. Some folks went to Philly, New York, a community in Cape May County called Whitesboro, so they just left. Folks with some money, they were able to get on trains and leave. Some actually stayed as well, but they knew, just to stay in their place and never really get involved in this political game ever again. So you have folks with some money that also stayed, some that were forced to leave never to return also. And in the white community, you had a lot of these folks who were behind the coup. A lot of them were high-ranking officials in the Civil War for the Confederacy. When you look at the major players, a lot of them were colonels, generals, lieutenants, all of that in the Confederate military, during the Civil War. And after they leave the Civil War, they get heavily involved in the Democratic Party, especially in Democratic politics, And so they start, getting into politics. Some of them even become lawyers as well. And also a lot of them start newspapers, also. And so they were able to use the newspaper to really spread their message of white supremacy as well. So you had those folks, with money and influence at the top, really controlling the folks at the bottom, who were getting these images and messages, just like, she was saying earlier, that a lot of people were illiterate during this time. And so the white supremacist movement really took advantage of that, with their newspapers and the imagery, and really, scaring people up, pretty much saying that African Americans that are in office, there's a lot of corruption going on, but the research now and the records, there was no, evidence of corruption at all. But that's the stuff they were putting out there. And also the fear of, Black men getting all the success. They're going to be sleeping with white women, your wives and your daughters. We know the story, same old stuff. And so they kind of used that to really rile up, your standard working class person. But at the end of the day, it never really benefited the city of Wilmington at all. Like I said, Wilmington was on this rise to be a major city in the South. But the massacre really stunted its growth. And I go to Wilmington all the time. I met my wife doing this film, and Wilmington's like a second home to me. And it's just shocking just to see what the possibilities could have been for that city. You see what I'm saying? So this white supremacy movement and this coup, it didn't even help, the average white person, because the city the growth of it just stunted. And you still see those effects to this day, especially with the African American population. This group of guys we recently interviewed, because I'm doing a follow-up to Wilmington On Fire called Wilmington On Fire Chapter 2. And this group, they've been collecting all this data, this historical research, and also a lot of disparities that are in Wilmington today. And they were like the medium income between Blacks and whites is just very large. White family, I think, averages probably about $69,000 a year. African Americans in Wilmington is like 25,000. You know what I'm saying? So in the population, African American population in Wilmington is, it's well under 20%. And that, I think the white population is about 75%. And so you can see those lasting effects that not only, across racial lines, but just the city as a whole as well.
Blake, I wanted to ask you, I used to live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and was not aware of the Tulsa massacre and the destruction or even existence of Black Wall Street until I went to the city and went to the wonderful cultural center that they have there in Greenwood. And what I learned was, one of the disturbing facts that I learned about what happened in Tulsa was the intentional cover-up by the white power structure, even when it happened. Newspapers that had covered the event they were all destroyed. Like, it's very difficult to find period coverage of the Tulsa massacre. And I'm wondering, was there a similar thing that happened with the Wilmington coup? Was there a deliberate attempt to erase what happened? Because clearly it's not taught in schools. Is it even taught in North Carolina schools? How was this event memorialized by the people who basically made it happen?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I think it's a really important distinction between Wilmington and Tulsa. Wilmington was a politically motivated, although also racially motivated, and very well planned, and actually in plain sight telegraphed event. They basically said what they were going to do. It was known what was going to happen all the way up to the White House, and McKinley was in the White House at the time. And my ancestor, George Henry White, who was a black sitting member of Congress at the time, went and met with him and told him that this was going to happen. Black pastors got together and went and told him this was going to happen. They went after it happened and asked for a federal response. None came. It was a political moment in which it seems like McKinley chose getting reelected over perhaps taking any kind of action that would align with his, outward beliefs that seemed to have been abolitionist. He was a Republican candidate. It just, no help came. This Tulsa, was a bit more. It happened later than this. First of all, this happened first. Tulsa happened in, I believe, 1921. And it was much more along the lines of a powder keg that was looking for a spark and was touched off by the usual kind of race riot kindling, which was usually the accusal, white women accusing black men of misconduct. It was an elevator operator that apparently did something to a white girl that has never really been substantiated. That's what happened in Tulsa. But it was probably, it was obviously a powder keg waiting to happen. And it was much more about economics there because the Black community was doing extremely well. They had their own everything on their side of town, and they were doing it better than the white side of town, and that wasn't sitting well. And so that was much more about prosperity and economic situation than it was specifically about politics. In Wilmington, it was a planned political coup. The two elections that led up to 1898 were making white folks in North Carolina very nervous that they were not going to be able to turn the tables and reverse the effects of the physical battlefield that they lost in the Civil War. And they knew that they were going to have to make a move to reestablish themselves as dominant in order to bureaucratically reverse the Civil War's on paper emancipation, but they were going to do it, reverse that bureaucratically. If they were going to do that, they had to make a move in this election. They knew it was critical. They telegraphed that they were going to do so in the news, and following right afterwards, because they had built this story that Black folks were going to riot on election day, that Black folks were stockpiling weapons. Black folks were trying to take over the government in Wilmington and shame the white man and rape the white women, and all of these, talking points that were over and over and over again emphasized. It would be also, I would be very lax in not mentioning Alexander Manly, who was a Black journalist at the time, a very progressive voice who pushed all of the Reconstructionist era ideas from his Black newspaper, the Daily Record. And he got in a bit of a tangle with a white lady, high society white lady, who had come out and said, if we are going to basically control these beasts, like Black men, we should just lynch one every day until they learn their lesson. Well, Alexander Manly came out and said in a published memo that if you're going to sit on your high horse and talk about rapists, then perhaps you should talk to your white men who are raping Black women and have for hundreds of years, including my mother by my white father. And by the way, these Black beasts that you like to talk about lynching are certainly sufficient enough for you all to fall in love with. If we're going to be honest about what's really going on, there are plenty of white girls falling in love with and willingly enjoying relations with Black men. So it was that alone was pushed as a huge talking point. Alexander Manly was told that he was going to be lynched on the day of the action of the violence. They burnt the Daily Record. They went looking for him. Luckily, he got out of town. So that was part of that rhetoric. So they had built a story leading up to the event that white people were going to be, victorious in putting down this riot. They then, after the event, publicized it as a Black riot and publicized themselves as the victors, saving, democracy and white women's safety going forward. And that was literally the night of, I think, already in the newspapers nationwide. That was the story. And if you look in textbooks, public school textbooks, all the way up until 1973, this event was couched in the fact that it was a race riot and that, nobler and smarter white heads prevailed and restored, order and put down the insurrection. So it was public relations as well as a telegraphed event in plain sight.
Yeah, just incredible information there. And for everyone that's watching, it takes a lot of intention, and we've all been conditioned to sort of couch these events as race riots. That is not what happened. Okay. Yeah. Black people were minding their business and racist white people came to tear shit up. So that's not a race riot. That does not a race riot make. So we all have to sort of be intentional with that language. I'm trying to make myself say uprisings and massacres as opposed to race riots because it's just sort of a default thing to say. But thank you very much for pointing that out, Blake. I'd like to thank you both so much for taking some time to share this very troubling yet important and contextual history with us. These are things that in stories that most people in America are not told. We have to go find these stories out for ourselves. So I appreciate you guys coming on here to share your knowledge with us. We've been speaking with author and writer and storyteller Blake Hill Saya. She's joining us today from LA. And Christopher Everett. He is the director of Wilmington On Fire. It's available on Vimeo. Christopher, where else can people find Wilmington On Fire? I'm going to check this out this weekend, by the way.
Yeah, you can check it on Vimeo. It's on Amazon Prime as well. And also, if you want to keep it Black owned, we on Quelle TV also. So all three of those platforms. And you can go to WilmingtonOnFire.com, and there's a link to everywhere you can see it. And be on the lookout for part. We're currently filming that. We've been filming that for about a year now. So it's like looking at Wilmington, over 120 years later.
We will be looking out for that. And thank you both for the work that you've been doing on this very important historical moment that more of us need to know about and still discuss. So thank you both for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Taure and Marcus, are you gentlemen still there with us? I wanted to just close kind of quickly and just kind of get your opinion based off, this wonderful history lesson that we just received from both Blake and Chris, and how to sort of contextualize that into what we're seeing in 2020, because I heard like a lot of overlapping things, to be perfectly honest, from the Trump people talking about the illegitimacy of the vote and legal votes and illegal votes, and these people shouldn't be voting and this, that, and the third. And a lot of that was similar rhetoric, propaganda from the time of 1898 when this Wilmington coup take place. Let me just get both of your reactions. Marcus, let me start with you.
They stole our freedom. They stole our independence. They stole our history. Our history has been stolen from us. And the irony is our current Secretary of Education is another person that through her books, herself and through her charter school teachings, she's trying to teach the next generation to ignore, factual things that has happened in history. So hearing that story is just another big old check mark for me about how reparations should be passed. I mean, if you don't hear that and you don't see the direct aspect of why African Americans are owed reparations from that to Tulsa, and I knew about that event, but I didn't hear about it in depth. And I mean, now we're talking like sort of closer to home. Mm-hmm. And then what about the towns that happened in that it wasn't recorded, that wasn't the size of Wilmington at the time? These are the things that concern me. I mean, we talk about Rosewood, we talk about Tulsa, we talk about Wilmington. We can add that to the list now, and so many other places where Black folks were lynched, lost their property. If you're not a supporter of reparations after hearing that story, then you are living in a different America than me.
Taure, this happened in your home state. I know it was not a surprise to you. You're familiar with it. But how do the echoes of what happened in the Wilmington coup of 1898 reverberate to sort of what we've been experiencing so far in 2020?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is just that if you look through across this history, and something I think a lot of folks don't think about is that America finds itself in crisis constantly. So even if you're looking around the 1890s, 1877, 1893, right, you're the government, capitalism is in a crisis again. And when that happens, people start to come together and ask questions, and they start to organize, and they start to use the means that are around them. So they start to engage into the electoral process, or they even organize outside of it. And what that becomes is dangerous to the overall management and empire, right? The strength of the capitalist system and who controls it. So even when I think about these events in Wilmington, and I think about other places, they know that the best way to keep people from organizing together is to sell the hate, right? It's to give what Du Bois calls like that psychological wage of whiteness to folks. And that's really all they got. And it's sad because I think about how many folks in Wilmington or North Carolina or poor white folks who do buy into this kind of Trump nationalism, white nationalism, or whatever, right? Not realizing that they are also being screwed over by the capitalist system as well, right? There's white folks in poverty all across North Carolina. And it's unfortunate for the ones who do think it's because of illegal Mexicans taking our jobs, or that, it's Black folks, causing too much ruckus, and that they're getting more attention via welfare or via, I don't know what they have materially to kind of back up that claim. But nonetheless, they're the ones kind of being screwed over. So that's what I think about in this current context, is just how some section of this ruling class still goes back to the same old, kind of set of racial politics. And it works, obviously. It works. It worked at least in 2016. But again, I think that, as conditions continue to worsen, as those white folks continue to be poor, can't get health care, can't get all that other shit, more and more of them are going to wake up and be like, you know what? I might hate Negroes, but you know what? I'm hungry at the same goddamn time, and they're fighting to try to get some food. So you know what? I'm going to join in with these motherfuckers, right? And then you're going to have some Fred Hampton ass people who will come through and organize their ass and under socialism, and it's going to be a beautiful fucking day. I'll probably be dead by the time it happens, but I hope it happens nonetheless.
We will all be way dead by the time that happens.